This story descends into the underbelly of medieval labor, a world where someone had to clean the sewers, drain the boils, and wipe the royal rear. We're talking about the gong farmer, the leech collector, the plague barrier, and yes, the royal butt wiper, officially known as the groom of the stool. Black humor flows freely as we meet these poor souls who did the dirty work, sometimes literally, so everyone else could pretend medieval life wasn't constantly soaked in bodily fluids. With no gloves, no masks, and zero dignity, these jobs were dangerous, disgusting, and somehow necessary. From crawling through cesspits with a bucket to collecting blood draining worms from swampy rivers at dawn, these people faced horrors every single day and were often paid shockingly well, but never enough. Compared to a bad office job today, you'll be thankful for your air conditioning and your distance from poop. The dawn broke over 14th century London, painting the sky in hues of sickly yellow and bruised purple, a fitting backdrop for the day's work. Thomas, our fictional composite gong farmer, woke not to the cheerful chirping of birds, but to the guttural groans of his own stomach and the ever present stench that clung to the city like a shroud. It was a smell that burrowed into your nostrils, a symphony of decay and disease, a pungent blend of human waste, rotting refuse, and the lingering aroma of 1,000 unwashed bodies. This was the perfume of London, and Thomas, more than most, was intimately familiar with its every note. He lived in a cramped, damp hovel near the Fleet River, a waterway that doubled as an open sewer, its waters thick with the city's refuse. His dwelling, shared with his wife and 3 children, offered little respite from the pervasive stink. The walls were perpetually damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something far worse, the ever present reminder of his profession. His meager possessions, a worn wooden stool, a rickety table, and a bed perpetually damp from the seeping river, were testament to his daily struggle for survival. His tools were as rudimentary as his life. A shovel, its wooden handle splintered and worn smooth from years of grueling labor. A bucket, perpetually stained with the evidence of his toil, and a crudely fashioned mask made from a piece of oiled cloth, offering little protection from the noxious fumes. He donned his mask, the coarse material scratching against his already chapped cheeks, the smell of the oil doing little to mask the far more potent stench to come. The work began with a shuddering sigh, a ritualistic acceptance of the day's torment. He trudged through the narrow, winding alleys, the cobblestones slick with the residue of spilled ale, and more ominously, something far less palatable. Each step was a precarious dance around overflowing gutters and festering piles of refuse. Rats, oh, bold and brazen, scurried through the muck, their beady eyes gleaming in the dim light. Scavengers in a city teeming with scavenged lives. He reached his first cesspit, a gaping maw of filth, a testament to the city's unchecked sewage system. It was a yawning chasm, filled to the brim with the putrid remnants of London's population. The air hung heavy with the smell of death, a suffocating mixture of methane, ammonia, and the indefinable stench of human decay. He braced himself, taking a deep breath, or rather a shallow gasp, and began the grim task of emptying the pit. His shovel plunged into the foul-smelling sludge, each scoop bringing forth a sickening mixture of waste and disease. He filled his bucket, its weight growing heavier with each ghastly load, the viscous contents sloshing against the sides, threatening to overflow and engulf him entirely. The work was backbreaking, arduous, and nauseating. The constant stench choked him, the physical strain left him aching, and the ever present risk of disease hung over him like a dark cloud. A single mishap, a tiny cut or scrape, could lead to infection. A swift and brutal end in a city where medicine was rudimentary and sanitation a mere fantasy. He knew many who had met their end in this way, their lives cut short by a single unfortunate slip. He was just one of many. As the day wore on, his body ached and his spirit sagged. He moved mechanically, his motions as rhythmic as a grim ritual. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the already stifling air into a suffocating oven. The sweat poured down his brow, mingling with the grim residue of his work. He paused frequently, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, the gesture stained with the gruesome testament of his profession. Midday brought a meager break, a crust of bread and a cup of water, often tainted and murky. He ate quickly, his eyes darting constantly around, his mind ever vigilant for the lurking danger of infection, or simply the chance of encountering the disapproving glares of the wealthier citizens he served. Even a meager rest often came with the constant presence of the stench, the ever present reminder of the realities of his world. The afternoon brought more of the same, a ceaseless cycle of emptying cesspits, hauling buckets, and dodging the ever present hazards of the city's unsanitary underbelly. The weight of his labor, both physical and emotional, felt crushing, yet he persevered. He was driven by a need to survive, to feed his family, and to maintain the only semblance of dignity he could grasp in this life. When the day finally ended, he returned to his damp hovel, his body aching, his clothes stiff with dried filth, and his spirit weary. The sun cast long shadows as he limped homeward, a figure consumed by darkness, a stark contrast to the opulence and luxury that flourished just steps away. The wealthy merchants, nobles, and landowners of London, whose lives were adorned with silks and spices, were completely oblivious to the tireless efforts that kept their world clean. They strolled through the city's streets, their noses unburdened by the stench that clung to Thomas's clothes, their existence untouched by the festering pits that lurked just out of sight. The sheer disparity between his daily struggle and their careless opulence was a chasm as wide and deep as the filth he removed. His meager wages, while seemingly high compared to some other laborers, were a cruel joke, a pittance compared to the comfort and luxury he helped sustain for those who could hardly acknowledge his existence. He was the unseen hand, the forgotten cog, who kept the machine of London running, though its benefits were enjoyed exclusively by those who never even considered his name. The stench, the constant threat of disease, the backbreaking labor, all of this was endured, not for personal gain, but for the privilege of keeping the opulent lifestyle of others untouched. It was a silent sacrifice, offered daily and largely ignored by those it served. It was, in essence, a dark comedy of societal imbalance played out daily under the pall of London's noxious breath. And Thomas, just one of many, played his part. But Thomas's plight, grim as it was far from unique. The city teemed with others toiling in the shadows, their lives as pungent and unsettling as the air they breathed. There were the night soil men, a brotherhood of the truly dedicated, whose task it was to collect the chamber pots from the homes of the wealthy, a job that required a constitution of iron and a nose of lead. Unlike Thomas, who at least dealt with centralized repositories of waste, these men navigated the labyrinthine streets under cover of darkness, their baskets overflowing with the night's refuse, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of flickering lanterns and the malevolent gleam of countless rodent eyes. Imagine the delicate dance of balancing a brimming pot of human excrement on a narrow, uneven street in the dark, only to have a rat dart out at the worst possible moment. Or the sheer physical effort required to carry the weighty load for miles, surely a contender for the most thankless occupation in the Middle Ages. Their reward? A meager wage, a life expectancy cut short by disease, and the everlasting stench clinging to their very being, a permanent olfactory signature of their chosen profession. Then there were the street cleaners, a legion of laborers armed with nothing but crude brooms made of twigs and bundles of straw. Their task was Sisyphean, a never-ending battle against the tide of filth that constantly threatened to engulf the city. They swept away the refuse, the discarded remnants of 1,000 meals, the refuse of animal markets, spilled ale, and the general muck of a city where sanitation was a mere whisper in the ears of the privileged. They were fighting a losing battle, of course. The sheer volume of refuse generated by a city like London, with its teeming population and lack of waste management, was insurmountable. Their efforts were merely delaying the inevitable, pushing back the tide for a few short hours before it rolled in again, stronger and dirtier than before. One can picture them hunched over, their backs aching, their hands raw, fighting a losing battle against an endless stream of dirt and debris. They struggled not just against the physical strain, but also the constant risk of injury and infection. A stray nail, a sharp piece of glass hidden beneath a layer of dung, a sudden fall into a particularly deep puddle of, well, one doesn't even want to think about the contents. And let's not forget the butchers, those unsung heroes of the medieval urban landscape. Their work was brutal, messy, and undeniably crucial to the city's survival. Their day did not end with the closing of their stalls. The aftermath of butchering, the blood, the offal, the discarded carcasses, had to be dealt with. Imagine the scenes: mountains of rotting meat, spilled blood staining the cobblestones a horrifying crimson, the gut-wrenching smell of decay permeating the air. The butchers, or rather their assistants, often young, underpaid, and overlooked, were tasked with the grim duty of carting this gruesome cargo away, disposing of it in the city's outer reaches. These were often not designated dumping grounds, but rather convenient locations outside the city walls, where the stench could be allowed to drift away from the noses of the more fortunate. The carcasses weren't magically removed, but rather were left to rot, becoming a banquet for scavengers, rats, and disease. These are just a few examples of the unseen workforce that kept medieval cities functioning, a cast of characters whose lives were far from glamorous but utterly essential to the survival of the population. There were leather workers, their hands stained with the pungent smells of tanning hides, whose workshops reeked of chemicals that would be considered hazardous, even by today's standards. Tanners whose work involved not just the hides, but the entire animal with its attendant smells, the process of soaking and treating hides before their eventual use, a practice often carried out near rivers and streams, polluting the water supply and creating a foul odor. Consider the fishmongers, whose stalls were a kaleidoscope of sights and smells, the glistening scales of fish, the pungent aroma of the sea mingling with the ever present city stench, and yet their waste, once their product was sold, still required disposal, further adding to the overall unsanitary conditions of the city. Then there were the tanners, dealing with the unpleasant but necessary task of processing animal hides, an industry that gave off an incredibly potent and unpleasant smell. The sheer diversity of these professions highlights the fact that the stench of medieval cities was not just limited to human waste. It was a complex and multi layered perfume, a blend of human and animal effluvia, decaying organic matter, and the industrial byproducts of various trades. Every corner held a new olfactory assault, a fresh testament to the lack of sanitation and the casual disregard for hygiene. Imagine walking down a medieval street, your senses assaulted by a cacophony of sights and smells, from the sights of butchered animals and mounds of refuse to the stench of open sewers and the ever present aroma of death and decay. One couldn't walk a single block without encountering a new layer of filth, a freshly discarded animal carcass, adding a layer of rancid meat aroma to the already heady mix of human waste. It was a world where survival required more than just strength and resilience. It demanded a certain level of olfactory fortitude. The residents of these cities weren't simply living alongside this filth, they were living in it, and the constant exposure had lasting effects on their health and well being. Beyond the immediate sensory assault, the lack of sanitation had dire consequences. The stench was not merely unpleasant, it was a harbinger of disease, a constant reminder of the ever present danger of pestilence. Every overflowing gutter, every festering pile of refuse, every open cesspit was a breeding ground for bacteria and pathogens. The city was a petri dish, and its inhabitants were the unwitting subjects of a deadly experiment. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were endemic, sweeping through the population with devastating regularity. Death was a constant companion, a grim specter that loomed large in the lives of the working class. It was a world where life expectancy was short and death was often brutal and unceremonious. The working class, who bore the brunt of the city's unsanitary conditions, had a life expectancy far lower than that of the wealthy. The wealthy, shielded in their relative cleanliness, seldom confronted the grim reality of their waste disposal system. Their reality involved fine silks, not the festering piles of refuse. Their comfort depended on being safely removed. The contrast was stark, a cruel joke played out daily in the shadow of the opulent city. The work was not just physically demanding and dangerous, it was deeply demeaning. Those who toiled in the city's underbelly were largely invisible, their contributions to the city's survival unacknowledged and unappreciated. They were the forgotten cogs in a vast and complex machine, their lives expendable, their labor taken for granted. Their stories, lost to time, serve as a dark testament to the stark inequalities of medieval society. The laughter of the wealthy echoed through the streets, a hollow sound against the backdrop of their unseen support system. These workers lived not just in stench, but in silence, their contributions swallowed by the obliviousness of the privileged few. Their lives, a testament to the unseen cost of societal advancement, were as unnoticed as the filth they tirelessly removed. Their stories offer a perspective on medieval life often overlooked, a powerful reminder of the human cost of societal structures that valued cleanliness for some and the acceptance of filth for others. The stench of medieval life, as we've explored, was a pervasive and inescapable reality, particularly for those who labored in the city's underbelly. But while the conditions were appalling, the economics of filth revealed a curious paradox. Some of those who dealt most directly with the city's waste actually commanded surprisingly high wages, at least relative to other laborers. This, however, is a cruel twist of the narrative. The high wages were not a reflection of fair compensation, but rather a stark recognition of the dangerous and repulsive nature of their work. A morbid market value placed on human endurance in the face of unimaginable squalor. Consider the night soil men, for instance. Their compensation, though meager by modern standards, was often significantly higher than that of a simple farm laborer or unskilled construction worker. This was not due to any inherent value society placed upon the removal of human waste, but a consequence of the sheer unpleasantness and risk involved. Finding individuals as willing to navigate the city's dark alleys, collecting and carting away brimming chamber pots, required a significant incentive. The risk of disease, injury, and even death was substantial, and the wage reflected this perilous reality. A night soil man's pay was, in a twisted sense, a life insurance premium, a compensation for the ever present threat of a swift and agonizing demise. Historical records, though patchy and incomplete, offer glimpses into these wage disparities. While precise figures are elusive, we can piece together a picture of the relative earning potential of various professions. A skilled craftsman, such as a carpenter or blacksmith, would undoubtedly earn more than a night soil man, but considerably less than a wealthy merchant. However, the night soil man would likely out-earn a day laborer, whose life was also fraught with hardship, although perhaps less viscerally repulsive than the night soil man's toil. The discrepancy is telling. It highlights the brutal realities of the medieval labor market, a market that valued not just skill and effort, but also the willingness to endure the utterly disgusting and dangerous. The high wages offered were not a sign of social justice, but rather a grim acknowledgment of the cost of maintaining the illusion of cleanliness for the privileged classes. The wealthy, ensconced in their relatively clean homes, paid a premium for the invisible workforce that kept their world sanitized, unknowingly purchasing not just sanitation, but a brief extension of their own lives. However, even these relatively high wages, relative only to the bottom rungs of the societal ladder, were ultimately inadequate when weighed against the life expectancy and living conditions of these workers. The constant exposure to disease, combined with the grueling physical labor, resulted in a life expectancy significantly shorter than that of the general population, let alone the elite. Imagine the night soil man, his days spent battling not just the physical demands of his work, but also the constant threat of infection. Every chamber pot he handled carried the potential for a deadly encounter. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, these were not just possibilities, but constant looming threats. The city streets, his workplace, were the breeding grounds of these diseases. And what of their living conditions? The night soil men, like many of the city's working class, lived in cramped, unsanitary dwellings, often packed together in the city's poorest neighborhoods. Their homes, if one could even call them that, were hardly sanctuaries, offering little respite from the pervasive filth of the city. These were not simply homes, they were often disease incubators, constantly exposed to the filth they themselves worked to remove. Their meager wages, while higher than some, were barely enough to provide adequate food, shelter, and clothing, let alone medical care. The irony was bitter. Their high risk work yielded slightly higher wages, but those wages still could not purchase a life free from the constant risk that had earned them those wages. Their slightly higher incomes were not a reward, but a grim compensation for a life lived on the brink of death. The contrast with the lives of the nobles and merchants was stark. The wealthy lived in relative comfort and cleanliness, oblivious to the grim realities faced by those who ensured their comfort. Their homes were spacious and well ventilated, their food plentiful and wholesome, their lives free from the constant threat of disease. Their waste was whisked away by the night soil men, unseen and forgotten, the source of their comfort masked in the darkness. The very act of their cleanliness and prosperity was based on a system of exploitation and casual disregard for the lives of the lower classes. Let's broaden our perspective to include other workers involved in the city's sanitation. The street cleaners, those who fought a Sisyphean battle against the never ending tide of refuse, also earned a wage that, while meager, was higher than many other laborers. However, their work was physically demanding, dangerous, and perpetually humiliating. The constant exposure to filth and the risk of injury contributed to their shorter lifespan, their lives shortened by the very work they did to ensure the longevity of those who paid them. The butchers, while earning a decent wage compared to unskilled labor, faced a different set of perils. The handling of raw meat, the constant exposure to blood and offal, and the arduous task of disposing of waste materials all contributed to a high risk of infection and injury. Their lives, too, were significantly shortened by the nature of their work. Their job required a specific type of resilience, not just physical, but mental, requiring them to navigate a world of gruesome sights and overwhelming smells day in and day out. Their labor produced the nourishment for the privileged, and yet their own nourishment was meager, their lives short. The leather workers, tanners, and fishmongers, each involved in trades that generated their own unique and potent stenches, similarly earned wages that reflected both the value and the repulsiveness of their work. The chemicals used in tanning, the handling of rotting fish, the processing of animal hides, these were all dangerous occupations, leading to health problems and a reduced life expectancy. Their contribution to the city's economy, crucial as it was offset by the extreme risks to their own well being and limited lifespans. The societal acceptance of their work and the resulting smells was not coupled with an adequate value of their lives. In conclusion, the economics of filth in the medieval city reveal a complex interplay of wages, working conditions, and societal values. While some of the workers involved in sanitation earned relatively high wages compared to unskilled laborers, these wages were hardly compensation for the dangerous and dehumanizing conditions they faced. Their surprisingly high pay served only to highlight the stark inequalities of the time. The vast chasm between the comfort and cleanliness of the wealthy and the perilous existence of those who ensured their privileged existence. Their lives, far from being glamorous, were brutal, short, and ultimately a testament to the unseen cost of societal advancement. Their stories, though often lost to history, serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of a system that valued cleanliness for some and the acceptance of filth for others. The stench of their toil, both literal and metaphorical, lingers even today. The stark reality, however, lay beyond the mere unpleasantness of their labor. The night soil men, the street cleaners, the butchers, the tanners, they lived with death as a constant companion, a grim specter that haunted their every waking moment. Their work was not just physically demanding, it was a death sentence, slowly, agonizingly served. The medieval city, with its overflowing cesspits and fetid alleys, was a breeding ground for disease, a place where life and death danced a macabre waltz. The plague, of course, casts the longest shadow, its periodic appearances, like a malevolent predator returning to a familiar hunting ground, decimated populations across Europe. But the plague wasn't the only killer. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, these diseases, born from the filth and squalor of the city, claimed victims daily. For the sanitation workers, these were not abstract threats, whispered about in hushed tones, but stark, immediate realities. Every overflowing chamber pot, every pile of rotting refuse, every carcass left to fester in the sun, these were potential sources of infection, each carrying the potential for a swift and brutal end. Imagine the scene: a night soil man, his hands raw and bleeding from contact with human waste, his clothes saturated with the stench of decay, staggering home at the end of his shift. He is exhausted, hungry, and vulnerable. A tiny scratch, unnoticed in the darkness, could be the gateway for infection. The simple act of drinking water could mean swallowing death. His home, a cramped, squalid dwelling shared with several families, offers little protection. The air is thick with the same foul odors that pervade his working life, a constant reminder of the precariousness of his existence. There, amidst the stench and the sickness, a family coughs and wheezes, a child's fever burning brighter with each passing hour. The wages earned, barely enough to provide sustenance, are utterly inadequate to fight the disease that will claim them. The lack of medical care compounded the problem. Medieval medicine, though not entirely devoid of efficacy, was often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting, purging, and other drastic remedies, often administered by unqualified practitioners, weakened already fragile bodies, accelerating their descent into death. For the sanitation workers, access to even this rudimentary medical care was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their meager wages, barely sufficient for food and shelter, left nothing for doctors' fees or herbs and remedies. Death was not only swift, but also utterly unaided, save for perhaps the whispered prayers of loved ones. Historical records offer fleeting glimpses into these grim realities. Tax records might show a sudden drop in the number of night soil men, a silent testament to a harvest of death. Parish registers record the rapid succession of burials, a stark reminder of the deadly efficiency of disease in the city's underbelly. These records, fragmented as they are, paint a picture of a community ravaged by illness, a community where death was not an exception, but an almost inevitable occurrence. The social consequences of these high mortality rates were far reaching. The constant turnover of workers meant a perpetual labor shortage. Families were torn apart by death, leaving behind widows and orphans to struggle for survival. The loss of life created a constant drain on the city's workforce, undermining its economic stability. The city's infrastructure, already strained, was further weakened by the lack of consistent sanitation services. The sheer number of dead bodies required disposal, becoming a dangerous task in its own right, often left to the already overburdened and dying population. Yet, despite the undeniable horror, there was a macabre resilience amongst these workers. They continued to perform their indispensable yet gruesome duties, their labor a silent pact with death. Their very survival was a testament to their strength and fortitude, their relentless endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. They were the invisible pillars upholding the clean facade of the city, their own bodies and lives paying the ultimate cost for the luxury of others' cleanliness. Their quiet sacrifices were overlooked, their contributions forgotten, their lives brutally short. The butchers, too, faced their own unique set of hazards. The handling of raw meat, the constant exposure to blood and offal, the relentless cycle of slaughter and butchering, all contributed to a high risk of infection. Cuts and abrasions, common in their work, often led to serious infections. They worked amidst the stench of blood and rotting flesh, their hands stained crimson, their aprons soaked with gore. The air hung heavy with the smell of death, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present threat of disease. Their own lives were often sacrificed on the altar of the city's hunger. The food they provided for the well-to-do was contrasted by the risk of constant illness. Consider the tanners, their hands immersed in noxious chemicals, their lungs choked by the acrid fumes of their trade. The stench of their workplace was legendary, a noxious cloud that clung to their clothes and their very being. Their work exposed them to a cocktail of dangerous substances, the long-term effects of which often manifested in debilitating illnesses. Leatherworking was a profession that eroded the body, slowly but surely, leaving its practitioners weakened and vulnerable. And the fishmongers, their days spent amidst the stench of rotting fish and the constant threat of injury from sharp fish bones and slippery surfaces. The pungent odor of their wares permeated their lives, clinging to their clothes and their homes, a testament to the arduous nature of their work. The handling of decaying fish exposed them to a variety of bacteria, leading to a host of potentially fatal infections. Their life, inextricably linked to the city's fish supply, was also a constant reminder of the short time between life and death. The medieval city, then, was a place of stark contrasts. The wealthy enjoyed relative comfort and cleanliness, their lives cushioned from the realities of disease and death. The sanitation workers, in contrast, lived and worked in a perpetual state of vulnerability, their lives a constant struggle against the onslaught of illness and infection. Their short lifespans and high mortality rates reflected the inherent inequalities of the system, a system that valued cleanliness for some and accepted the filth and death of others to maintain that cleanliness. The cost of the clean streets was paid in human lives, countless lives silently offered up on the altar of societal advancement. Their stories, often lost to history, deserve to be remembered, a poignant testament to the human cost of progress and the enduring power of stench, both literal and metaphorical. The shadow of their suffering, the lingering odor of their struggle, remains a potent reminder of the past. The stench of the medieval city, as we've seen, wasn't merely unpleasant. It was a harbinger of death, a constant suffocating reminder of mortality's chilling embrace. But the physical reality of disease and decay was only half the story. The other, equally grim, half involved the social standing, or rather the profound lack thereof, of those who bore the brunt of the city's filth. Their lives were not only precarious, but also deeply stigmatized. These were the forgotten workforce, the unsung heroes, or perhaps anti heroes, depending on your perspective, of medieval hygiene, whose essential labor was met with disdain and social exclusion. Consider the night soil men, those unsavory individuals whose job it was to empty the city's cesspools and chamber pots. Their work was undeniably crucial. Without them, the medieval city would have drowned in its own waste. Yet, this vital service was performed at the cost of their social standing. They were outcasts, literally and figuratively, dwelling on the margins of society, their very existence tainted by the stench of their trade. They were not simply laborers, they were the embodiment of filth, a living representation of everything deemed unclean and undesirable. Their social isolation was not simply a matter of personal preference, it was actively enforced. They were often forbidden from entering certain areas of the city, their presence considered polluting. They were relegated to the poorest districts, their homes cramped and squalid, reflecting their low social status. Marriages were difficult to arrange. Who would willingly have their daughter marry a man who spent his days wading through human waste? Even the most desperate maidens shied away from a union destined to perpetuate their family's existence on the social margins. Their interactions with the rest of society were limited, confined to the brief, transactional moments when they exchanged their services for meager payment. The very act of providing such a vital service made their lives socially impossible, a grotesque inversion of the notion of community. The social stigma attached to their work extended beyond the night soil men. Butchers, tanners, and fishmongers also faced similar prejudices, though perhaps to a lesser extent. Their professions, while essential to the functioning of the medieval city, were often associated with death, decay, and unpleasant odors. The butcher, whose hands were perpetually stained with blood, was seen as a figure of violence, a grim reaper of the livestock world. The tanner, surrounded by the acrid fumes of his workshop, was perceived as someone who dealt with the foul and the diseased. Even the fishmonger, whose wares often had an interesting smell, was subject to a degree of social distancing. These occupations, essential as they were considered lowly and demeaning. The individuals who undertook them were often viewed with a mixture of pity, disgust, and fear. They were the underbelly of medieval society, the invisible workforce that kept the city functioning, but at a considerable social cost. They represented the grim reality that underpinned the veneer of medieval grandeur, a reality that the wealthy and powerful preferred to ignore. Theirs was a life lived in the shadow of societal disdain, a world where their essential contributions were met with social isolation and perpetual poverty. The family dynamics of these workers were also shaped by the social stigma associated with their jobs. Marriages were often arranged within their own communities, creating a sense of solidarity and mutual support, but also limiting their prospects outside their marginalized existence. Children often followed in their parents' footsteps, inheriting not only their profession, but also the social stigma that came with it. Generational poverty and social exclusion were rampant, creating a cycle of despair that was difficult to break free from. The community they formed, born of necessity, provided a crucial support network, but it also tragically perpetuated the very isolation they were trying to mitigate. This stark social stratification is surprisingly echoed in modern society. While we may no longer have night soil men, there are still numerous professions that, despite their vital importance, are often undervalued and stigmatized. Think of sanitation workers, garbage collectors, and sewage treatment plant operators. These individuals perform essential services that maintain public health and hygiene, yet they are often relegated to the margins of society. They are, in a way, the modern day counterparts of the medieval sanitation workers, their labor essential, their social standing low. Even jobs considered far safer and cleaner still are often met with societal bias. Similarly, the prejudice against certain occupations, such as butchers, slaughterhouse workers, and those involved in waste management, persist to this day. While their work is crucial to the food supply chain and environmental health, they often face social stigma and are underpaid for the crucial role they play. The shadow of societal disdain, therefore, stretches across centuries, affecting not only the mental but physical health of workers across time. In many ways, the social dynamics of the medieval workforce provide a cautionary tale, a reminder that the essential work of maintaining public health and hygiene often comes at a significant social cost. The forgotten workforce of the medieval period serves as a poignant reminder that even in societies that venerate progress and advancement, certain essential labor is consistently relegated to the shadows and its workforce to societal indifference. A grim truth that continues to permeate our own society, even if we would prefer to not acknowledge it. The scent of social inequality, much like the stench of medieval refuse, lingers on. The stench of the privy, even in a palace, was a potent force. It hung heavy in the air, a constant, pungent reminder of the human body's less than regal functions. While the king and queen dined on roasted peacock and spiced wine, a different kind of feast was occurring in the more private chambers, a feast of a far less appetizing nature. This was the realm of the grooms of the stool, men whose job title, however euphemistic, spoke volumes about the less than glamorous reality of their daily lives. They were, in essence, the king's and sometimes queen's personal cleaners, responsible for the most intimate and frankly disgusting aspects of royal hygiene. Their duties transcended simple chamber pot emptying. It was a multifaceted role that required a delicate blend of discretion, physical endurance, and a stomach of iron. They were privy to the king's most private moments, attending to his bodily needs with a level of intimacy that most courtiers could only dream of, or rather nightmare of. They were confidants of a sort, albeit ones who witnessed the king in his most vulnerable state, a stark contrast to the image of regal authority projected to the public. The sheer physical demands of the job were considerable. Royal diets, though lavish, were not always kind to the digestive system. A king's meals could consist of rich meats, heavy sauces, and potent wines, hardly the recipe for a smoothly functioning gut. The grooms of the stool were therefore perpetually on call, dealing with the consequences of the king's dietary indulgences. Imagine the sheer volume of waste produced by a man who ate like a king and drank like a sailor. The sheer volume of it would be enough to make even the strongest stomach churn. Their proximity to power, however, was a double edged sword. While their work was undeniably unpleasant, it also granted them a level of access denied to most. They were often privy to royal secrets, whispered confessions made during moments of physical vulnerability. This intimacy, while potentially fraught with peril, a misplaced word, an overheard comment, could also translate into considerable influence. A trusted groom, one who knew how to keep his mouth shut and his wits about him, could become a powerful figure behind the scenes, a silent advisor with unique insight into the king's health and mood. Historical records, while often scant on the specifics, do offer glimpses into the lives of some notable grooms of the stool. Though their names are rarely mentioned in grand chronicles, their influence is sometimes detectable in the court's machinations. We find hints of their presence in the accounts of royal expenditures, in the occasional anecdote that slips into less formal writings. These fragments paint a picture of a profession that was paradoxically both lowly and influential, a testament to the strange workings of medieval power dynamics. One particularly intriguing example, although the names are lost to time, the pattern remains strikingly consistent, concerns a groom who managed through a combination of discretion and loyalty to secure a position of significant influence during a period of courtly intrigue. He was, by all accounts, a man of few words, but those words, when spoken, carried considerable weight. He was the silent observer, the man who saw the king at his weakest, and who, because of that proximity, could manipulate circumstances to his advantage. The details of his machinations are, unfortunately, lost to history, swallowed by the sands of time and courtly secrecy. Yet the very existence of such individuals highlights the surprising power dynamics inherent in such a seemingly lowly position. Consider the psychological toll. The constant exposure to the king's most private moments, the intimate knowledge of his physical vulnerabilities, could not have been without its effects. These were not men who could simply shut off their brains at the end of the day. Their professional lives were inextricably intertwined with the emotional and political currents of the court, a never ending current of intimate vulnerability and public display. The weight of this constant intimacy, the burden of secrecy, must have been immense. Further compounding their challenges was the social stigma associated with their profession. Though their proximity to power might elevate their status to a certain extent, they still worked with excrement and bodily fluids, tasks deemed utterly degrading by most of society. This meant that even their elevated status within the walls of the palace did not translate to comparable social standing outside its gates. Their lives were a peculiar paradox, highly influential behind closed doors, yet perpetually marked by social stigma once they stepped beyond the palace walls. It was a life lived in a shadow world, forever caught between the opulent grandeur of the court and the pervasive smell of human waste. The social lives of the grooms of the stool were, to say the least, complicated. Marriage prospects were likely limited, as few women would desire a husband who spent his days tending to the king's posterior. Their social interactions likely revolved largely around their fellow grooms, creating a close-knit brotherhood bound by their shared experiences and the unique challenges of their profession. This internal solidarity, however, could not completely mitigate the social isolation they faced in the wider world. It was a life that demanded exceptional discretion, loyalty, and a constitution of iron. The grooms of the stool occupied a strange space in medieval society. They were simultaneously close to the pinnacle of power and yet deeply entrenched in the most physically and socially unsavory aspects of royal life. Their lives were a stark reminder that even within the glittering world of the medieval court, the mundane, the unpleasant, and the profoundly human continued to exist, casting a peculiar and often unacknowledged shadow over the veneer of royal majesty. The contrast between the opulent splendor of the royal court and the grimy reality of the groom's work is striking. Imagine the tapestries, the jeweled goblets, the lavish feasts, all existing alongside the relentless reality of cleaning up the king's messes, both literally and figuratively. The juxtaposition is jarring, a constant reminder that even in the most privileged environments, the messy business of human existence continues unabated. Their work, while crucial to the maintenance of the king's health and the smooth functioning of the court, was largely unseen and unacknowledged by the wider population. They were the unseen hand that kept the machinery of royalty running smoothly, the silent custodians of a rather unpleasant truth. The grooms of the stool represent a silent, often overlooked stratum within the social hierarchy of the medieval court, a poignant reminder of the hidden realities that always exist beneath the surface of historical narratives, far from the glittering facades and grand pronouncements. Their lives were a constant negotiation between intimacy and social distance, power and humiliation, a tapestry woven from threads of the mundane and the extraordinary. Their story, though often hidden, is a crucial one, for it reveals the often ignored human dimension of medieval power and the persistent contrast between the illusion of grandeur and the unavoidable realities of life itself. And those realities, while less discussed, were often just as powerful in shaping the trajectory of history itself. The royal court, a glittering spectacle of silks and jewels, possessed a less glamorous underbelly, a realm far removed from the pomp and circumstance of banquets and jousts. While the king's physicians prescribed potent potions and prescribed rest cures, a different kind of medicine was practiced, one reliant on the slimy, wriggling bodies of leeches. This was the domain of the leech collectors, individuals whose lives were as murky and often as unpleasant as the creatures they harvested. Their work, though crucial to the functioning of the court's medical practices, remained largely hidden from view, a stark contrast to the public image of royal authority. Imagine the scene: a swamp, thick with mud and the stench of decaying vegetation. Mosquitoes buzzed incessantly, their high-pitched whine a constant soundtrack to the work at hand. The air hung heavy with humidity, the oppressive heat clinging to the skin like a second layer. This was the leech collector's workplace, a far cry from the polished halls of the palace. These individuals, often poor and lacking in social standing, ventured into these pestilential environments, armed with nothing more than crude tools and an almost supernatural resilience. The process of leech collection was far from sanitary. Leeches, prized for their supposed medicinal properties, were gathered from the murky waters of swamps and stagnant ponds. They clung to reeds and submerged vegetation, their dark bodies glistening in the sunlight. The collectors, often wading knee-deep in mud and water, would carefully detach the leeches, one by one, using their hands or rudimentary tools. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring patience and a certain degree of dexterity. The leeches were then transported to holding containers, often simple earthenware jars or crudely fashioned wooden boxes. These containers were seldom cleaned thoroughly, leading to a breeding ground of bacteria and other pathogens. The leeches, packed tightly together in these unsanitary conditions, were frequently subjected to overcrowding, disease, and starvation, creating the perfect storm of disease prone conditions. The sheer density of leeches in these containers, combined with the lack of proper ventilation, resulted in an overpowering stench, a miasma of decay and dampness that clung to the collectors long after they left the swamp. The risks associated with leech collecting were considerable. Swamp fever, malaria, and various other waterborne illnesses were a constant threat. The collectors often suffered from skin irritations, cuts, and infections caused by contact with the contaminated water and the leeches themselves. Exposure to the elements, the intense heat, the relentless humidity, the swarms of biting insects further added to their physical burdens. Their work was not only arduous, but also dangerous, demanding a level of physical and mental endurance that was rarely acknowledged or appreciated. The leeches themselves were not without their perils. Some species of leeches were venomous, capable of inflicting painful bites and causing serious complications. Others carried parasites that could infest the collectors, leading to long-term health problems. The work demanded not only physical fortitude, but also a high tolerance for risk and acceptance of the inherent dangers associated with their profession. The societal perception of leech collectors was equally unfavorable. Their work, deemed unclean and degrading by most of society, relegated them to the fringes of the social hierarchy. They were often ostracized, their profession viewed with disgust and disdain. Their lowly status was further reinforced by the unsanitary conditions under which they worked, which only served to reinforce existing prejudices. Despite the considerable risks and social stigma, the demand for leeches remained high. Medieval medicine, in all its primitive glory, placed great faith in bloodletting, and leeches were the preferred method of achieving this. They were believed to possess the power to draw out bad humors from the body, curing a wide range of ailments, from headaches to gout. The belief in the efficacy of leech therapy was widespread, extending from the common folk to the royal court. The leech collectors, therefore, found themselves in a peculiar position. Their work, while essential to the medical practices of the court, cast them outside the social pale. They were simultaneously indispensable and ostracized, their contributions to royal health largely unacknowledged by the broader society. They were, in effect, the invisible hand that kept the medical machinery of the court running smoothly, a silent testament to the often unseen elements that underpinned even the most opulent of societies. The transportation of the leeches from the swamps to the palace was another challenge. The containers, often poorly sealed, would leak and smell. The journey itself was long and arduous, and the leeches often suffered losses through starvation and mortality. The arrival of the leeches at the palace was not exactly a celebratory moment. The royal physicians and surgeons, accustomed to the relatively clean environment of the palace, would handle the containers with as little contact as possible due to the stench and potential for disease. The application of leeches to patients was a spectacle in itself. The leeches were carefully selected and applied to specific areas of the body, depending on the ailment. The process could be both painful and messy, with considerable blood loss. Yet, it was considered a highly sophisticated procedure, a testament to the advancements in medieval medicine, or at least to the prevailing medical paradigms. The effectiveness of leech therapy, however, remains debatable even today. While some anecdotal evidence suggests some efficacy in treating certain skin infections and possibly localized inflammation, there was no scientific basis behind its application. The social life of leech collectors was as grim as their occupation. Marriage prospects were limited. Their low social status and unsanitary profession were not attractive to most potential partners. Their social circles were confined to other leech collectors, a tight knit community bonded by their shared experiences and the harsh realities of their lives. Their lives were characterized by isolation and social marginalization, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the royal court they served. The story of the leech collectors is a reminder of the hidden realities of medieval society, the unsung heroes, and the unseen forces that shaped its dynamics. Their lives were a paradox, a mixture of the essential and the marginalized, their contributions to the well being of the royal court obscured by the stench of their profession and the prejudice of the wider society. They were the silent, often overlooked witnesses to the grand spectacle of medieval life, a testament to the human cost of even the most seemingly glamorous settings. Their narrative, while often absent from the official chronicles, is a crucial element of the broader tapestry of medieval social history. It's a story steeped in the pungent smell of swamps and the grim reality of medieval medicine, a reminder that even in the heart of power, the realities of poverty, disease, and the persistent struggle for survival lurked just beneath the surface. The contrast between the gilded cages of the court and the squalor of the swamp is a jarring one, highlighting the vast chasm that existed between the privileged few and the many who toiled in their shadow, their lives a testament to the enduring inequalities of the era. The very leeches that they so diligently collected, symbols of medieval medical practice, also served as a poignant metaphor for the unseen burdens and often unacknowledged contributions of the marginalized members of medieval society. The royal kitchens, a labyrinthine warren of scorching ovens, hissing spits, and bubbling cauldrons, presented a different kind of inferno. While the leech collectors battled swamps and disease, the cooks and kitchen staff fought a daily battle against heat, exhaustion, and the ever present threat of culinary catastrophe. Forget the romantic image of a bustling, jovial kitchen. This was a scene of controlled chaos, where the air hung thick with the smells of roasting meats, simmering stews, and the ever present undercurrent of sweat. Imagine the scene: a vast, stone walled kitchen, its air thick with smoke and steam. Huge hearths roared, their flames licking at massive cauldrons filled with bubbling concoctions destined for the royal table. The floor, slick with spilled grease and stray vegetables, was a treacherous landscape for the weary kitchen staff, their feet perpetually blistered and aching. The air itself was a brutal assault on the senses, hot, acrid, and choked with smoke that stung the eyes and left a film of soot on everything. The cooks, typically male, wielded their cleavers and knives with the expertise of seasoned warriors, their movements precise and swift, a dance honed by years of practice. Their assistants, often younger and female, performed the more menial tasks, peeling vegetables, chopping herbs, carrying heavy pots and pans. Their hands were perpetually raw and chapped from the constant scrubbing and the searing heat of the ovens. Accidents were commonplace. Burns were an occupational hazard, a grim reminder of the unforgiving nature of their profession. A careless swipe of a hand against a hot cauldron could result in agonizing pain and permanent scarring. Spills were inevitable, leading to treacherous puddles of grease that threatened to send even the most seasoned kitchen worker sprawling. The threat of scalding from boiling water or searing oil was a constant companion, hovering over every task, every movement. The work was physically demanding, requiring immense strength and stamina. Hours were long, often extending from dawn till well into the night, especially on days of grand feasts. And sleep was a luxury, snatched whenever possible amidst the din of the kitchen. The constant heat, the heavy lifting, and the relentless pace of the work took a heavy toll on their bodies, leaving them exhausted and aching. Food safety by modern standards was non existent. The preservation techniques of the time were rudimentary at best, relying heavily on salt, spices, and the sheer volume of food being prepared. Spoilage was a constant concern, leading to outbreaks of food poisoning. Those who were unlucky enough to succumb to the illnesses were swiftly replaced, their misfortune a testament to the harsh realities of working in the royal kitchens. The pressure to deliver perfection was immense. The slightest flaw in a dish, a misplaced herb, or a poorly cooked piece of meat could result in the royal displeasure, which could have dire consequences. The cooks, therefore, worked under constant pressure, their every movement scrutinized, their every creation subject to the whims of the royal palate. Their status, despite their essential role in the running of the royal court, remained relatively low, more akin to skilled laborers than members of the court's inner circle. The hierarchy within the royal kitchen was strict and unforgiving. The head chef held absolute authority, his decisions final and often arbitrary. The cooks and their assistants, jockeying for favor and seeking to avoid the head chef's wrath, created a volatile mix of ambition and fear. Mistakes were punished harshly, ranging from verbal abuse to physical chastisement, and often a loss of standing in the kitchen, leading to less favorable tasks and reduced pay. The ingredients themselves posed unique challenges. The preservation of meat, in particular, was a constant struggle. The lack of refrigeration meant that large quantities of meat had to be salted and cured, or smoked or preserved in other ways. Spoilage was a constant threat, and the cooks had to develop an acute sense of smell and sight to identify potentially spoiled food. Spices, while adding flavor and possibly possessing some preservative qualities, were expensive and not always readily available. The logistics of feeding a large royal court was an impressive feat of organization. The procurement of ingredients, the scheduling of meals, and the coordination of the many kitchen staff involved in the process required considerable skill and expertise. The kitchens were not merely places for preparing food, they were highly sophisticated logistical hubs, functioning with surprising efficiency given the primitive tools and technologies available. The tools of the trade were often basic and crude: wooden cutting boards, cleavers, and knives made of iron or steel, and massive cauldrons over open fires were the staples of the kitchen. The ovens, behemoths of stone and brick, required great skill and experience to manage. The heat was intense, and the cooks had to develop a keen sense of timing and temperature control to avoid burning their creations. Beyond the daily grind of cooking, the kitchen staff had other responsibilities. They cleaned, maintained the equipment, and oversaw the storage of food. These tasks were just as physically demanding and often just as dangerous as the cooking itself. The constant exposure to heat, grease, and smoke took its toll on their health, leading to respiratory problems and other ailments. The social lives of the kitchen staff were often as chaotic as their working lives. Their long hours and low social standing meant they had little time or energy for leisure or social activities. Their social circles were confined to other kitchen staff, creating a unique subculture defined by their shared experiences and their mutual understanding of the pressures and demands of their demanding work. Their stories, like those of the leech collectors, remain largely untold, yet their lives were crucial to the functioning of the royal court. They toiled in the shadows, their labor essential but largely unseen, their struggles and triumphs largely ignored by the historical record. The next time you feast your eyes on a romanticized depiction of medieval life, remember the cooks and kitchen staff, the unseen hands that made the royal feasts possible, the unsung heroes of the royal kitchen, toiling in the heat and smoke, their lives a testament to the hidden costs of even the most glamorous of settings. Their existence serves as a poignant reminder of the vast disparities of medieval society, the unseen sacrifices made by many to maintain the opulence and comfort of the few. Their lives, as arduous as they were, are as crucial to the full tapestry of the medieval world as the exploits of the kings and knights who often overshadow them. Beyond the steaming cauldrons and the clatter of cleavers, a whole other world of grime and drudgery existed within the royal court. While the chefs toiled under the pressure of creating culinary masterpieces, an army of unseen workers ensured the court's illusion of effortless splendor. Their lives were far from the romanticized tapestries and illuminated manuscripts often depicting court life. These were the unsung heroes, the cleaners, the laundry workers, the waste disposers, the individuals whose tireless labor kept the royal stink at bay and the royal linen pristine. Consider the cleaners, for example. Their task was not simply to sweep a few crumbs from a polished floor. The royal court was a sprawling complex, a labyrinth of chambers, hallways, and private apartments, each generating its own unique blend of dirt, filth, and, well, let's just call it unpleasantness. Imagine the task of cleaning the privy, the latrines, the overflowing chamber pots that were the reality of medieval sanitation. The stench alone was enough to curdle milk. Yet these individuals tackled it daily, armed with little more than buckets of water, coarse cloths, and a tolerance for the truly revolting. Their hands, perpetually raw and chapped, were stained with a kaleidoscope of muck, a grim testament to their daily struggle against the court's pervasive filth. They worked in near darkness, with limited access to soap or other cleaning agents, their work often overlooked and undervalued. A slipped foot on a greasy floor, a fall into a bucket of fetid water, These were commonplace occurrences that often led to injuries that went untreated. Then there's the laundry. Picture mountains of soiled linen, bed sheets stained with wine and sweat, clothes dirtied with mud and grime from countless journeys, and the countless napkins used during the endless feasts. The washing process itself was a backbreaking affair. Laundry workers, mostly women, spent their days scrubbing clothes against rough washboards, pounding them with mallets, and then hanging them to dry in the wind and sun. The lack of proper detergents and the harshness of the process often damaged the fabrics, further increasing their workload. Furthermore, these individuals often had to contend with infestations of lice and other parasites that were rampant in the often damp and poorly ventilated laundry rooms. The relentless scrubbing was often performed in freezing cold water during winter, left their hands raw and blistered and their bodies aching. Their noses were frequently assaulted by the pungent aroma of unwashed linen, a smell that clung to their clothes and their very being. There was little glamour in this work. It was a cycle of relentless toil that demanded constant physical effort, leaving them perpetually exhausted and sore. But perhaps the most arduous and unpleasant task fell to those responsible for waste disposal. The management of human waste, kitchen refuse, and other detritus generated by a large community was a significant logistical challenge. The lack of sophisticated sanitation systems meant that these workers often had to wade through muck and grime, their job a constant battle against disease and pestilence. They worked in close proximity to cesspits and other unsanitary conditions, putting them at high risk of infection. The work was not only physically demanding, but also extremely dangerous. The risks of falling into a pit or contracting an infectious disease were ever present threats. Their job was often done in the dead of night, away from the prying eyes of the court, their labor crucial, but their existence largely invisible. Their contributions were essential to maintaining the court's health and preventing outbreaks of diseases that could easily decimate the entire community. The social status of these workers mirrored the unpleasantness of their work. They were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, considered little more than expendable cogs in the court's vast machine. They received little in the way of pay, their labor barely recognized beyond the essential function it fulfilled. Their lives were marked by poverty and hardship, with limited access to health care or other essential services. Their social lives, too, were restricted. Their long hours and low social standing offered little time or opportunity for leisure or social interaction. Their existence was a silent testament to the vast gulf between the privileged few who enjoyed the court's luxury and the countless individuals who toiled in the shadows to maintain that illusion of splendor. Moreover, the mortality rates among these workers were alarmingly high. Exposure to disease, injuries from the harsh working conditions, and inadequate nutrition contributed to a significantly shorter lifespan compared to other members of the court. Their deaths often went unrecorded, their lives swallowed by the vastness of history, leaving behind little more than a faint whisper of their existence. Their stories are largely lost to us, yet their labor is the foundation upon which the glamour and splendor of the royal court were built. Their unseen toil provided the backdrop for the courtly intrigues and royal pronouncements that fill the historical record. They were the quiet architects of a courtly illusion, a testament to the unseen hands that kept the royal machine running. And what about their living conditions? Most lived in cramped and squalid quarters, often located in the less desirable parts of the court, exposed to the elements and close to the sources of filth and disease. The lack of privacy and the constant presence of disease added to their already arduous lives. Their children, if any, often shared their parents' harsh existence, contributing to the family's meager income from a young age. The work was passed down through generations, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and hardship that was difficult to break. There were no social safety nets. Illness or injury could easily lead to destitution, leaving these families to face their misfortunes alone. The tools of their trade were as simple and crude as their living conditions. Coarse brushes, worn out buckets, rusty tools, and patched clothing were their constant companions. Innovation and technological advancements were largely absent from their lives. Their tasks remained essentially unchanged for centuries, their work characterized by the same laborious methods and exhausting routines. They were skilled workers in their own right, possessing expertise in cleaning, laundry, and waste management, but their skills were never celebrated, nor were their contributions recognized beyond the bare necessities of survival. Their lives were a testament to the invisible labor that underpins even the most opulent societies, their stories a grim reminder of the unseen costs of grandeur. Their silent efforts contrast sharply with the noise and spectacle of court life, their sacrifices shaping the narrative, even as they remained nameless in the record. The next time you encounter a romanticized depiction of the medieval court, remember the cleaners, the laundry workers, and the waste disposers. Remember the harsh conditions they endured, the relentless toil they suffered, and the silent dignity with which they performed their work. Their stories may be lost to the annals of history, but their labor remains an essential part of the tapestry of medieval life, a silent testament to the hidden costs of power, privilege, and the illusion of courtly magnificence. They are the forgotten artisans of cleanliness, the unsung heroes of hygiene, whose tireless efforts kept the royal stink at bay, proving that even in the most lavish settings, the shadow of unpleasant reality always lurks close at hand. Their lives, though shrouded in obscurity, offer a valuable counterpoint to the often glorified narratives of medieval history, reminding us that true beauty often lies in the unseen details and the quiet struggles of those who worked tirelessly to keep the facade of grandeur intact. Their contributions, though often unnoticed, were essential to the very fabric of the medieval world, a silent testament to the human cost of historical grandeur. The king's privy, a masterpiece of carved oak and inlaid ivory, might have impressed visiting dignitaries with its seemingly exquisite craftsmanship, but behind the polished surface lurked a reality far removed from courtly elegance. The reality was a symphony of smells, a potent blend of stale urine, decaying matter, and the ever-present musk of unwashed bodies. The chamber pots, emptied with a disconcerting slosh, were only a temporary solution, their contents eventually finding their way to the court's less than glamorous subterranean network of cesspits. These were not elegantly concealed. They were often located alarmingly close to the kitchens, their fetid contents occasionally seeping into the foundations, adding a certain je ne sais quoi to the royal stew. Maintaining a semblance of cleanliness in such an environment was a Herculean task, a never ending battle against the tide of filth. The royal cleaners, a ragtag band of individuals relegated to the lowest rungs of the social ladder, were the frontline soldiers in this war. Their tools were rudimentary at best: buckets of water, often foul smelling itself, rough cloths, and a seemingly endless supply of grit. Soap was a luxury, a rare commodity reserved for the privileged few. The cleaners often resorted to mixtures of ash, urine, and herbs, a potent cocktail far from the perfumed concoctions favored by the aristocracy. They worked in the dead of night, their labors hidden from the eyes of the courtiers, their movements furtive and quiet, a stark contrast to the boisterous celebrations and glittering balls that characterized the court's daytime life. Imagine the sheer volume of waste generated by a court teeming with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Food scraps, discarded clothing, animal carcasses, and of course human excrement all contributed to a monumental sanitation problem. The court's waste disposal system, or rather its lack thereof, was a marvel of inefficiency. Waste was often simply dumped into pits or thrown into nearby ditches. The stench emanating from these areas was pervasive, a constant reminder of the court's underlying unsanitary conditions. The unfortunate souls tasked with managing this waste faced constant exposure to disease and filth. They were the unseen custodians of the court's hidden horrors, their labor vital, yet their existence utterly unremarked. The royal laundry was another source of both glamour and grime. The mountains of soiled linen, the king's silk shirts, the queen's velvet gowns, the endless supply of tablecloths and napkins from countless feasts presented a logistical nightmare. The washing process was an arduous affair, a physically demanding task that involved scrubbing clothes against rough washboards, pounding them with mallets, and then hanging them to dry in the open air, often exposed to the elements. The lack of effective detergents and the harshness of the washing methods frequently damaged delicate fabrics, leading to further work and frustration for the laundry workers, mostly women. Their hands were perpetually raw and bleeding, their clothes perpetually damp and smelling of mildew and stale sweat. Lice infestations were a common problem, a constant companion in the damp and poorly ventilated laundry rooms. The relentless scrubbing, often performed in freezing cold water during winter, left them perpetually exhausted and aching. The constant exposure to unsanitary conditions exposed them to a range of diseases, often leading to illness and even death. Yet despite the harsh conditions and the meager wages they received, they worked tirelessly, their labor essential to maintaining the court's illusion of effortless elegance. Their silent struggles, their aching bodies, their perpetually chapped hands, all contributed to the very image of courtly splendor they were so diligently striving to maintain. It was a tragic irony indeed. The disposal of human waste was a particularly challenging aspect of courtly sanitation. Chamber pots overflowed, latrines were frequently clogged, and the stench was, to put it mildly, overwhelming. The individuals tasked with emptying these receptacles, cleaning the latrines, and disposing of the waste were, to say the least, not treated with the same consideration shown to the royal courtiers. Their social status reflected the unpleasantness of their work. They were at the very bottom of the social ladder, viewed as little more than necessary evils. Their work was not only physically demanding, but also incredibly dangerous. The risk of contracting infectious diseases was ever present, and accidents, like falling into a cesspit, were not uncommon. These risks were often exacerbated by a lack of proper safety measures and inadequate medical care. The mortality rates among these workers were alarmingly high, their lives tragically short. Their deaths often went unrecorded, their contributions to the court's hygiene entirely overlooked, swallowed by the annals of history. They were the unseen architects of the court's illusion of cleanliness, the silent guardians against the ever present threat of disease and pestilence, a testament to the unseen struggles that supported the court's extravagant facade. The irony was almost unbearable. The royal court, a symbol of wealth and power and refinement, was built upon the backs of those who toiled in squalor, their lives a constant battle against filth and disease. Their unseen efforts, their silent sacrifices, served as the foundation upon which the court's splendor was constructed. They were the unsung heroes of hygiene, their lives a poignant reminder that even in the most opulent settings, the shadow of unsanitary conditions lurked just beneath the surface. The contrast between the luxurious lives of the court and the grim reality faced by those responsible for maintaining its cleanliness was stark and jarring. While the king and queen dined on delicacies served on silver platters, the cleaners worked in near darkness, their hands perpetually raw and bleeding. While the courtiers adorned themselves in lavish silks and velvets, the waste disposers waded through human excrement and decaying refuse. This contrast is a powerful reminder of the vast social inequalities that characterized medieval society and of the often hidden costs of grandeur. The court's cleanliness was a carefully constructed illusion, maintained by the relentless toil of those who were themselves denied even the most basic standards of hygiene. Their story, though largely untold, is a critical component of the medieval narrative, a stark counterpoint to the more romanticized and idealized depictions often found in historical accounts. Beyond the glittering tapestries and the polished floors, beyond the courtly intrigues and royal pronouncements, there existed a parallel reality, a world of grime and drudgery that was essential to the very functioning of the royal court. This world was populated by individuals whose names are mostly lost to history, but whose contributions were nonetheless essential to maintaining the illusion of courtly splendor. Their stories, though often overlooked, deserve to be told, not as a macabre tale, but as a reminder of the unseen sacrifices that underpinned even the most magnificent of societies, a testament to the human cost of grandeur, and a darkly humorous reflection on the enduring paradox of luxury and sanitation. The royal court, after all, was a palace built on a foundation of filth, a monument to both human ingenuity and the enduring human struggle against the most basic of realities, keeping things clean. Even kings and queens, it seems, cannot escape the inevitable consequences of living amongst their fellow mortals. The stench, even from a distance, was enough to curdle the stomach. It wasn't merely the smell of death, it was a symphony of decay, a gruesome orchestra conducted by the bubonic plague. Whole streets lay deserted, the houses shuttered, their inhabitants either succumbed or in desperate flight. The air hung heavy with the sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh, mingling with the acrid tang of burning wood, the pyres of the recently deceased. The living were a shadow of their former selves, their faces gaunt and drawn, their eyes hollow pits of fear. The plague wasn't just a disease, it was a thief, stealing not only lives but also the very fabric of society. The task of disposing of the dead fell upon the shoulders of the unfortunate few left behind. These were not professional gravediggers, not men of solemn piety performing a sacred rite. They were often the poorest of the poor, the desperate, the outcast, those with little to lose in a world where death held little terror. Some were driven by a grim sense of duty, others by the pitiful wages offered, a desperate attempt to stave off starvation for themselves and their families. For many, it was a choice between risking infection and certain starvation. Imagine the scene: a hastily dug pit, a grim charnel house, overflowing with the bodies of the recently departed. The earth, already saturated with rain and seepage from the overflowing cesspits, offered little resistance to the shovels. Each body, a grotesque parody of life, was unceremoniously tossed into the communal grave, a jumbled mass of limbs and decaying flesh. There was no time for elaborate rituals, no comforting prayers, no gentle lowering into the earth. It was a brutal, hurried affair, a desperate race against the ever spreading contagion. The air was thick with the stench of death, a nauseating miasma that clung to the clothes and hair of the workers, a constant reminder of their perilous task. These gravediggers, the plague's unwitting undertakers, faced unimaginable risks. They worked in the midst of death, their bodies constantly exposed to the virulent plague bacteria. Their tools, crude and inadequate, were often shared, spreading the contagion as effectively as the disease itself. Their clothes, perpetually soiled with the fluids of the deceased, acted as a breeding ground for infection. Protective gear, if it existed at all, was rudimentary at best. A simple cloth mask offered little protection against the airborne pathogens, and protective gear was a luxury most could not afford. The emotional toll was equally devastating. These men and women witnessed horrors that would haunt their waking hours and plague their dreams. They saw loved ones perish, friends and neighbors become mere corpses, their familiar faces twisted in the agony of death. They were forced to confront the most profound aspects of human mortality day after day without the respite of even basic emotional support. Many went mad under the relentless pressure, their sanity slowly eroded by the relentless horrors they witnessed. The stories they carried, the sights they saw, etched themselves in the deepest recesses of their minds. The silent screams of the dying, the desperate pleas for mercy, the sight of entire families wiped out. These were the images that haunted them long after the plague had subsided. They were the keepers of a collective trauma, their minds bearing the weight of a community's shared grief and despair. Sometimes, cremation was preferred to burial, especially when the plague was at its most virulent. The pyres blazed day and night, consuming not only the bodies of the dead, but also the hope of the living. The smoke, a miasma of death and despair, hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the pervasiveness of the plague's lethal grasp. The wood itself was often scavenged from ruined buildings or stolen from the few remaining functional structures. Even this was a battle for resources, for space, for time. The task of tending the pyres was as hazardous as that of burying the dead. The intense heat, the acrid smoke, the risk of accidental burns, these were only some of the dangers faced by those responsible for this grim duty. The burning flesh, crackling and popping, added a grotesque soundtrack to the nightmare. The acrid stench of burning flesh filled the air for miles. an unmistakable marker of the plague's relentless advance. Those who remained alive often sought refuge from this stench by taking to the furthest reaches of the city. The societal response to this mass mortality was a mixture of fear, denial, and desperate attempts at control. Quarantines were haphazardly enforced, sometimes successful, more often failures. The very foundations of social structures crumbled under the weight of the plague's relentless advance. Fear bred mistrust, communities fractured, and families were torn apart. The rigid class structures, normally so strictly enforced, fractured as people fought for survival against this ubiquitous foe. The rich and the poor both perished, albeit in different manners. The authorities, often overwhelmed and helpless, were criticized for their inefficiency. Some blamed the plague on divine retribution, others on sorcery or astrological alignments. There was no clear understanding of the disease's mechanism, no effective treatment, no way to stem its deadly tide. Religious fervor reached a fever pitch, with prayers, processions, and desperate appeals to divine intervention becoming commonplace, yet offering little solace. The churches, often overcrowded with the dying, became centers of infection, further accelerating the spread of the disease. Ironically, many of those most devout, the ones seeking solace in religion, were amongst the first to perish. The plague burials were more than just a grim task. They were a visceral representation of the profound societal disruption caused by the disease. They were a testament to the human capacity for resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity, and a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the vulnerability of even the most seemingly robust social structures. The aftermath was an eerie silence, punctuated only by the wind whispering through empty streets. The living were left to grapple with the immeasurable loss, their lives forever scarred by the memory of the plague and its grim harvest. The cost of survival was not simply the financial burden of losing loved ones. It was the emotional cost of living with such unimaginable loss, the constant threat of death, and the deep-seated trauma that followed. The shadow of the plague, long after the last body had been laid to rest, continued to cast its dark pall upon the survivors, a haunting reminder of a time when death reigned supreme. The stench of death, already a pervasive presence, was amplified tenfold in the poorer districts. These weren't the neatly swept lanes of the wealthy, but a labyrinth of narrow, twisting alleys where refuse piled high, a festering monument to neglect. Houses, or rather hovels, huddled together, their walls crumbling, their roofs leaking, offering little protection from the elements or the ever-present disease. These weren't places of refuge. They were breeding grounds for pestilence. The air hung thick with the miasma of rotting food, human waste, and the lingering scent of disease, a suffocating cocktail that assaulted the senses and weakened the body. Water, often contaminated, flowed sluggishly through open ditches, carrying with it the detritus of daily life and the seeds of countless infections. Rats, brazen and unafraid, scurried through the streets, their bodies bloated with disease, their sharp teeth a constant threat. The sheer density of the population in these areas further fueled the spread of disease. Families, often large and extended, crammed into single rooms, shared beds, and breathed the same contaminated air. There was little privacy, little space for hygiene, and no escape from the constant threat of infection. A single cough, a single sneeze, could be the harbinger of death, and death, when it arrived, was often swift and brutal. The poverty of these districts wasn't simply a lack of material possessions, it was a profound absence of agency. The poor lacked access to basic necessities like clean water, sanitation, and health care. They were trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and disease, where ill health meant lost work, which meant further impoverishment, and with it, an even greater susceptibility to disease. They were powerless against the onslaught of the plague. Even the slightest ailment, a fever, a cough, a simple wound, could quickly escalate into a fatal illness. They lacked the resources to seek medical care, even if such care existed. Their meager diets, barely sufficient for survival in the best of times, offered little resistance to infection. Consider the diet of the poor, a monotonous fare of bread, perhaps some thin broth, and whatever scraps they could glean. Fresh fruit and vegetables were luxuries they could not afford, their bodies depleted of essential vitamins and minerals that might have boosted their immunity. Their strength, already compromised by malnutrition, offered little defense against the onslaught of disease. They were not simply malnourished, they were effectively starved into submission. The plague was not only attacking them physically, it targeted their already weak constitutions. The lack of sanitation was catastrophic. Open sewers overflowed, their contents mingling with the rainwater to create a fetid swamp that permeated everything. The stench was inescapable, a constant reminder of the grim reality in which they lived. Even the smallest wound could become rapidly infected due to the constant exposure to bacteria in the environment. There was no concept of waste disposal, creating a potent breeding ground for disease carrying insects. The entire environment seemed actively hostile to life. Healthcare, if it could be called that, was a cruel joke. The few physicians who dared to venture into these areas were often poorly trained, their remedies ineffective, and their knowledge limited. They were often as poor and desperate as their patients, their efforts hampered by a lack of resources and an inadequate understanding of the disease. Herbal remedies, often ineffective and sometimes even harmful, were the most accessible forms of treatment. The plague ravaged these impoverished communities disproportionately. The living conditions that were already hazardous, the already weak immune systems, the lack of access to health care, all formed a perfect storm of death. The mortality rate in these areas was far higher than in the wealthier districts, a stark reflection of the cruel inequalities of the time. The social consequences were equally devastating. The death of so many members of a family left behind broken homes, orphaned children, and the overwhelming burden of caring for the sick on the shoulders of the already exhausted. Families were shattered with no support systems in place to help them recover. The social fabric, already fragile, unraveled further. Even surviving the plague left people emotionally scarred, often with long-term health problems such as disabilities or mental illness. The death of the head of the household, almost invariably the working man of the family, often meant absolute ruin. With no breadwinner, children were left without adequate care, frequently leading to starvation or being taken in by workhouses, which were often just as harsh and life-threatening. Widows, often with several young children, were left to fend for themselves. They usually turned to begging, prostitution, or petty crime to survive, often placing them at further risk of infection and social exclusion. The women were frequently subject to abuse and violence, with no protections and no support network. The plague wasn't simply a disease, it was a catalyst that revealed and amplified the pre existing social inequalities. It exposed the vulnerability of the poor, their complete lack of power in the face of such a devastating force. The very structures designed to protect society, the government, the church, even the family, were powerless to prevent the carnage. It laid bare the hypocrisy of a society that preached piety and charity while simultaneously allowing its most vulnerable members to perish in such appalling conditions. The silence after the plague was only punctuated by the wail of a child and the incessant squeak of vermin in the rotting foundations. The survivors carried the scars of this experience. The economic and social consequences lingered long after the last pyre had died down. The memory of the plague became a potent symbol of societal failure, a reminder of the grim realities of poverty and inequality. The price of survival was high, measured not just in lives lost, but in shattered families, shattered communities, and a profound sense of collective trauma. Even those who escaped death were left with the haunting specter of fear and suffering, a haunting reminder of the delicate balance between life and death, wealth and poverty, and a society's responsibility to those who needed it most. The pervasive stench of poverty and disease, a lingering reminder of the era's callous indifference, left a bitter taste that would linger for centuries. The plague, as brutal and indiscriminate as it was, didn't merely kill bodies, it fractured the social order. The death of so many, particularly among the working poor, exposed the inherent fragility of a system that relied on their labor. The sudden and catastrophic loss of manpower sent shockwaves through the economy, creating shortages and driving up prices. Bread, already a staple, barely affording sustenance, became a luxury beyond the reach of many. The moral economy, that unwritten social contract based on the perceived fairness of prices and the availability of basic necessities, shattered. The sudden scarcity, exploited by unscrupulous merchants and profiteers, led to widespread resentment and desperation. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a question of justice. The poor, already facing unimaginable hardship, now found themselves victims of a system that seemed designed to crush them. Imagine the scene: a market square, usually bustling with activity, now a scene of simmering tension. Haggard faces, etched with grief and hunger, pressed against the stalls. The prices of essential goods had skyrocketed, reflecting the scarcity rather than the actual value. A loaf of bread, once attainable with a day's labor, now demanded the earnings of a week. The desperation was palpable, the air thick with accusations and suppressed rage. Whispers turned to shouts as individuals, fueled by hunger and desperation, dared to challenge the merchants, their words laced with the bitter taste of betrayal. The just price, a concept ingrained in the medieval worldview, had been violated, and the moral economy, the unspoken agreement that underpinned their society, had been brutally broken. This wasn't simply a matter of economics, it was a challenge to the very fabric of society. The church, often seen as a protector of the poor, found its authority questioned. The promises of divine intervention and heavenly reward seemed hollow in the face of such suffering. The cries of the desperate were not answered with charity, but with indifference, further fueling their anger and resentment. The line between pious acceptance and outright rebellion became increasingly blurred. The starving masses found their faith tested, questioning whether divine justice truly existed or if it was simply a cruel joke played upon the afflicted. The stories that emerged from this period are filled with instances of desperate attempts to regain a semblance of control. We find instances of peasants seizing grain stores, their actions driven not by inherent malice, but by the sheer desperation of starvation. They weren't thieves in the traditional sense. They were taking what they saw as rightfully theirs, believing their survival justified their actions. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully constructed acts of defiance against a system that left them with no other choice. The acts of resistance, often localized and spontaneous, represent a potent expression of collective action against injustice. Accounts of these events frequently reveal a fascinating interplay of beliefs, motivations, and consequences. While some acted out of pure desperation, others were clearly motivated by a deep sense of injustice. These acts were driven by the belief that they were being cheated, deprived of their basic human needs, not by an abstract entity like the system, but by specific individuals, the merchants, landlords, or even officials who allowed the system to function in this unjust way. The rhetoric used in their protests frequently invoked the moral order, claiming they were merely reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. These weren't mindless riots. They were carefully articulated, if chaotic, expressions of rebellion against a moral economy that had been violated. The authorities responded with a mixture of brutality and pragmatism. In some cases, rebellions were crushed with swift and merciless violence, but in others, the authorities recognized the legitimacy of the grievances, leading to temporary concessions or price controls. This demonstrated the precarious balance between popular unrest and state power. The authorities understood the danger of allowing such unrest to escalate. Too much force could further inflame the situation, while too much leniency might embolden future challenges to their authority. The responses varied greatly depending on local conditions, the severity of the unrest, and the political climate of the time. The consequences of these uprisings were varied and far reaching. While some rebellions were swiftly quelled, leaving only a trail of victims and a lingering sense of fear, others resulted in temporary improvements in living conditions. Sometimes price controls were temporarily enforced, rationing introduced, or measures taken to alleviate the worst of the suffering. These brief periods of relative stability often provided a small window of respite, a moment to rebuild, to reestablish the fragile social fabric before the next crisis struck. However, even when seemingly successful in their immediate aims, the long-term consequences were frequently bitter. The authorities rarely forgot the challenges to their power. The rebellion, no matter how justifiable, often marked those involved for life, leaving them vulnerable to future persecution. The memories of these uprisings served as potent symbols of resistance, influencing future generations in their struggles against oppression. Furthermore, the plague and the resulting social upheaval significantly altered the social landscape. The death of so many individuals reshaped communities, disrupting established hierarchies and creating opportunities for social mobility, however grim. The sudden lack of skilled labor, for example, could lead to advancements for individuals who previously were denied access. Yet these opportunities were often born from the ashes of disaster, the benefits unevenly distributed. The stories of plague, poverty, and social upheaval reveal a complex tapestry of human experience, a mixture of fear, desperation, courage, and resilience. The responses to this calamity showcased the precarious nature of the social contract and the explosive potential of a population pushed to its limits. The moral economy, the unwritten agreement between those in power and those who were not, was shattered, creating a void filled with both brutality and rebellion. The legacy of these events lingered for generations, reminding us that the price of survival is often measured in more than just lives lost. The cost includes the ongoing struggle for justice, the relentless fight against oppression, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be silenced. The stench of decay may have faded, but the echoes of rebellion continue to resonate through history. The stench of death, a constant companion during the plague years, clung to the very air. It was a smell that seeped into the fabric of life, a grim reminder of mortality that mingled with the ever present aroma of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. And yet, in the face of such overwhelming devastation, the people clung to their faith, however frayed and tested it may have been. Religion, a cornerstone of medieval life, offered both solace and a framework for understanding the inexplicable horror unfolding around them. But it was a faith often warped and twisted by fear, superstition, and the raw desperation of survival. The church, the dominant institution of the time, offered a narrative to explain the plague's devastating march. It was, many believed, divine retribution. God, in his infinite wisdom, or perhaps his infinite displeasure, had unleashed this scourge upon humanity as punishment for sin, for wickedness, for the straying from the righteous path. This interpretation, while offering a semblance of order in a chaotic world, also placed a heavy burden on the already suffering populace. The weight of collective guilt, the fear of being singled out as a vessel of divine wrath, added another layer of torment to the physical suffering. Confessionals, usually sanctuaries of quiet reflection, became sites of desperate pleas for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to appease a seemingly wrathful God. The rituals of the church, normally sources of comfort, were now imbued with a palpable sense of urgency and dread. Masses became occasions of collective prayer, a desperate chorus of voices pleading for mercy. Processions, usually solemn affairs, transformed into frantic movements, a desperate attempt to appease the unseen forces that were decimating their communities. The tolling of church bells, normally marking the hours or announcing joyous occasions, now served as a mournful dirge, announcing another life claimed by the plague. But alongside the official pronouncements of the church, a rich tapestry of folk beliefs and superstitions flourished, often intertwining with and sometimes contradicting the teachings of the clergy. These beliefs, born from centuries of accumulated lore and passed down through generations, offered alternative explanations for the plague's origins and suggested different methods of protection. Amulets and charms, imbued with supposed protective powers, became highly sought after commodities, a desperate attempt to ward off the unseen evil. Herbs and potions, often with dubious efficacy, were concocted and consumed with fervent hope, reflecting a deep-seated belief in the power of nature to combat supernatural forces. The imagery surrounding these folk beliefs was often grotesque and unsettling. The plague, personified as a malevolent entity, was imagined in various forms: a skeletal figure riding a pale horse, a shadowy specter lurking in the shadows, a venomous serpent slithering through the streets. These personifications, far from being simply metaphorical, reflected a deeply felt sense of dread, a visceral understanding of the plague's power to invade and destroy. The narratives associated with these personifications were often harrowing, filled with stories of ghostly encounters, ominous warnings, and supernatural interventions. One particularly prevalent superstition centered around the belief in the power of contagion. The fear of spreading the disease led to the ostracization of the sick, the creation of physical and emotional barriers between the healthy and the infected. This fear, fueled by a lack of understanding of the disease's mechanism of transmission, led to horrific practices of social distancing, of isolating those afflicted to prevent the spread of the pestilence. The sick were often left to die alone, their cries for help unanswered, a tragic testament to the effectiveness of fear in creating divisions within communities. Yet, alongside the darker aspects of superstition, there were also acts of unexpected kindness and compassion. The belief in the interconnectedness of the community, the understanding that even in the face of death, human connection was paramount, led to acts of extraordinary generosity and mutual support. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing what little food they had, tending to the sick, and burying the dead. These acts of charity, often undertaken at great personal risk, served as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. This juxtaposition of fear and faith, of superstition and compassion, characterized the response to the plague. While the official narrative of divine retribution offered a framework for understanding, it also generated profound guilt and fear. Folk beliefs, while often illogical and occasionally harmful, provided a sense of agency and control in a situation where people felt utterly helpless. The responses to the plague were as varied and complex as the people who lived through it, a kaleidoscope of human emotions and beliefs, reflecting both the best and the worst aspects of medieval society. The religious landscape itself was deeply affected by the plague. The Church's authority, already challenged by internal divisions and external forces, was further tested by the scale of suffering. The promises of divine protection seemed hollow in the face of such widespread death, leading to questioning and even outright rebellion against the Church's authority. The stark reality of death, the daily confrontation with mortality, caused some to abandon their faith entirely, while others clung to it with even greater fervor, seeking solace and meaning in a world consumed by chaos. The plague's impact on religious practices was profound. The rituals of the Church, adapted to fit the exigencies of the time, often combined traditional forms of worship with more immediate expressions of devotion. Prayers for the sick and the dead became commonplace, as did processions and ceremonies intended to appease divine anger. The focus shifted from abstract theological concepts to the immediate realities of life and death, highlighting a palpable shift in the relationship between the people and their faith. The sheer scale of death created a paradoxical situation for the Church. The need for priests and religious officials to administer last rites and bury the dead was immense. Simultaneously, many clergy also perished, resulting in a shortage of religious personnel. This created a crisis within the Church, affecting its capacity to provide spiritual support to its community and maintain its own internal structure. The survivors, both clergy and laity, were forced to reevaluate the structure and role of their religious institutions in a world fundamentally transformed by the plague. The intertwining of religious beliefs and superstition extended beyond the purely spiritual realm. The plague's impact was so profound that it seeped into the everyday realities of life, transforming the way people perceived the world and interacted with one another. Social structures were shaken to their core, forcing a reassessment of established hierarchies and norms. The traditional systems of social control, including those maintained by religious institutions, were tested by the sheer magnitude of death and the resulting social upheaval. The aftermath of the plague witnessed a profound reassessment of the relationship between religion and society. While the church's authority survived, it was not unscathed. The experience of widespread death and suffering called into question some of the church's most fundamental tenets, causing a degree of skepticism and doubt among a populace deeply scarred by the plague's devastating passage. The social fabric, once seemingly stable, was forever altered, and with it, the very nature of faith itself. The plague, therefore, serves not merely as a historical event, but as a potent symbol of the constant interplay between faith, fear, and the human condition. The narratives of survival, both spiritual and physical, provide a window into a world grappling with existential questions, a world where the line between piety and desperation was often blurred. The legacy of the plague extends beyond the sheer numbers of the dead. It touches upon the very core of the human experience, revealing the resilience of the human spirit, the power of faith, and the enduring influence of superstition in the face of death. It is a legacy that continues to resonate through the ages, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, humanity's search for meaning and solace endures. The stench of death, that persistent companion of the plague years, finally began to fade, replaced by the more mundane, if equally unpleasant, smells of mud and decay. The physical scars left by the pestilence were slowly healing, but the deeper wounds, the psychic trauma etched onto the collective consciousness, remained. The survivors, those who had stared into the abyss and somehow blinked back, carried the weight of their experiences, a burden etched into their very souls. And from this crucible of suffering, surprisingly, emerged some vital lessons, albeit lessons often learned the hard way through the agonizing cost of countless lives. One of the starkest lessons was the absolute necessity of sanitation. The medieval working class, crammed into overcrowded tenements, lived in squalor unimaginable to most of us today. Their proximity to filth, the overflowing cesspits, the uncollected refuse, the omnipresent rats, provided the perfect breeding ground for disease. The plague, in its horrific efficiency, exposed the deadly consequences of ignoring basic hygiene. It wasn't simply a matter of cleanliness for aesthetic reasons, it was a matter of life and death. The rotting garbage, the fetid water sources, were not mere inconveniences, they were active participants in the gruesome dance of death. The connection, while perhaps dimly understood at the time, was undeniably there. The plague was a brutal teacher, emphasizing the direct link between environmental conditions and public health. And while we may enjoy the luxury of advanced medical knowledge, it's worth remembering that medieval healers, working with limited resources, and a rudimentary understanding of disease offered a glimpse into the crucial role of healthcare. Their remedies, often bizarre by modern standards, stemmed from a deep seated faith in the power of nature, a belief system interwoven with a fascinating blend of religious conviction and practical experience. Their limited tools, their reliance on intuition and herbal remedies, reveal a poignant picture of desperate attempts to cope with an invisible enemy. While their effectiveness was often questionable, their dedication and compassion provide a striking counterpoint to the pervasive fear and superstition. Their very struggles highlight the importance of sustained scientific inquiry and accessible medical care. Yet, even with sanitation improvements and improved medical knowledge, these are only part of the equation. The plague revealed a critical failing in the social fabric of medieval society, a profound lack of worker rights. The most vulnerable, those already struggling to survive, bore the brunt of the pandemic's impact. The working class, forced to labor in dangerous and unsanitary conditions, faced not just the threat of the plague, but also the constant threat of starvation, exploitation, and social injustice. Their lives were precarious even before the plague's arrival, and the pandemic only exacerbated their existing hardships. The pandemic threw into stark relief the deep rooted inequalities within medieval society. The wealthy, with their larger homes, access to better resources, and ability to flee to safer environments, fared better than the working class huddled together in crowded slums. This inequality wasn't simply a matter of fortune, it was a systemic issue built into the structure of society itself. The pandemic acted as a magnifying glass, highlighting the injustice of a system that left so many vulnerable. The lessons from this are profoundly relevant today. We must learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure that in the face of crises, the burden of suffering is not disproportionately borne by the most vulnerable. This reflection on the medieval working class's experience isn't merely an exercise in historical nostalgia. It's a crucial reminder of the long shadow the past casts upon the present. Modern society, with its advancements in sanitation, healthcare, and social welfare, often seems worlds apart from the medieval world. But the underlying issues, the vulnerability of the working class, the importance of public health, and the ever present threat of infectious disease remain strikingly familiar. Consider, for example, the ongoing challenges of global pandemics. The COVID 19 pandemic, though vastly different from the Black Death, mirrored some of the same vulnerabilities. The unequal access to healthcare, the economic disparities exacerbated by the crisis, and the anxieties surrounding disease transmission all echo the experiences of the medieval world. The pandemic served as a stark reminder that even in the 21st century, we remain susceptible to the same basic threats. The medieval working classes' fight for survival in the face of the Black Death also underlines the importance of workers' rights. We often take for granted the protections afforded to modern workers, safe working conditions, fair wages, and access to health care. But the medieval experience underscores the fragility of these rights, highlighting the need for constant vigilance and advocacy. The lessons of the past remind us that the fight for economic justice is far from over. The historical parallels are not perfect, of course. Modern society possesses technological and scientific advancements that medieval society lacked. However, the underlying social dynamics, the inequalities, the vulnerabilities, the struggles for survival remain relevant. The study of history, in this sense, isn't merely a recounting of past events. It's a vital tool for understanding the present and shaping the future. The plague, viewed from a modern perspective, doesn't just offer a morbid fascination. It presents a complex tapestry woven from threads of suffering, resilience, and adaptation. It exposes the flaws in societal structures and the enduring human spirit's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The stories of those who lived through the plague, the nameless laborers, the desperate healers, the victims, and the survivors, speak volumes about the human condition and the importance of acknowledging the past to build a better future. It's a story that reminds us that despite technological advancements and improvements in sanitation, our inherent vulnerabilities remain, highlighting the crucial role of social justice, accessible healthcare, and a renewed commitment to understanding and preventing the recurrence of similar tragedies. The lessons from the past are not merely historical trivia, they are vital tools for navigating the complexities of the present. The experience of the medieval working class during the plague offers a stark reminder of the crucial link between sanitation and public health, the profound impact of social inequality, and the persistent need for workers' rights. By engaging with this history, we gain a deeper understanding of our own vulnerabilities and the importance of learning from the mistakes of the past to build a more equitable and just society. It's not simply about avoiding another plague, it's about building a world where such profound suffering and systemic injustice are less likely to occur. It's about ensuring that the lessons learned from the agonizing experiences of the medieval working class are not merely historical footnotes, but guiding principles for a fairer, healthier, and more humane future. The echoes of those long ago cries of suffering should serve as a constant reminder of the price of complacency, the cost of neglecting basic human needs, and the enduring power of collective action in the face of adversity. The legacy of the Black Death isn't just about remembering the dead, it's about ensuring that future generations don't suffer a similar fate. It's a challenge that transcends time, echoing through centuries, urging us to heed the warnings of the past and strive for a more just and equitable future for all. The shadow of the plague still lingers, not as a specter of fear, but as a call to action,